My name is Sarah Simpson. I'm the gallery director. We have 3 gallery spaces here. If you haven't checked out all 3 galleries, I highly recommend you do. We have 3 shows on view right now. Milk Tongue, which we're going to be hearing more about shortly, is on view through March 11th. And then we also have Art Across Campus in the Project Space Gallery and Black, White, and Full Color in the Open Space Gallery, which are both up through February 18th. So now I'm happy to turn it over to our moderators and our panelists and get everything started. Oh, one more thing before I do that. If you are here and looking for lead credit, find me at the end of the conversation and I will scan you in. Thank you.
Here you go. All right, I guess we'll start by introducing ourselves. There's a lot of faces I'm unfamiliar with. So I'm Carrie Smith. I teach in the art department as a part-time faculty. I teach 3D design, although I mostly am an oil painter. And so I see some students, and that's great. Yeah, so I make sculptures as well as paintings, and I forget what else I was going to say. Ashley Cooper and I co-curated this show. We started talking about it in fall of 2019 in my first semester here, and I don't know why she asked me to work on it with her, but I guess my interest was that in graduate school, I started a body of I started recreating a historic timeline of birthing chairs, sort of how ideologies of birth have been encapsulated in objects that support women in giving birth. Still working on it, but anyway, that was sort of part of my interest. And I am not a mother. I chose not to be a mother, in part because I helped raise my brother, and that was enough. And now I have to live out my childhood as an adult. But anyway, I'm going to pass it to Ashley. I'll try to keep it brief.
So I think one of the things that, or the thing that inspired this show was that we felt like this topic had been overlooked in our history and ignored. So I think the question we would like to start with, I think I'm going to start with Sallie, and then we'll go off from that. Is why do you think that a topic that seems so essential to human life is so often ignored in our history?
Okay, I'm Sallie Han. I'm an anthropologist.
Oh, we didn't introduce ourselves. Sorry. Sorry. Let's start over. Okay. I messed up. I'm Ashley Cooper, and I helped. I teach here, and I'm a painter, and I also helped to curate this show. And we're going to go down and introduce ourselves. So there you go.
Okay.
So I'm Susan Weil. I'm not an artist. I am a mother, and I'm a psychotherapist. I work at Bassett, integrated into the pediatric department and the women's health department. And I work with pregnant and postpartum women and their families. And I also work with random children aged between 3 and 19.
I'm so glad you're all here. My name is Kyrin Hobson. I am a visual artist with a research-based interdisciplinary practice, embracing mostly painting and installation. My work stems from a Black feminist perspective, and through that lens, I investigate U.S. history and diaspora history, social aspects of racial formation, and really the core of my practice is looking at the experience of mothering and maternal fetal health outcome disparities in the U.S.
I'm Summer Cunningham. I'm an assistant professor of communication here. I'm also a mother, and I had my son my freshman year of college and mothered through BA, MA, PhD. And so I started studying motherhood because of my experience and because that was the only way I could juggle both of those endeavors, which are very, very demanding endeavors. So I'm interested in some things related to that experience, access to higher education for parenting students, especially for mothers. But I'm also interested in how we garner more collective conversations around the topic of motherhood, because it is a topic that a lot of people aren't interested in unless or until they do that work. And I think that it's really important that we talk about it.
It's me again. I'm Sallie Han. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist. So, and my research specialization is in reproduction. So I wrote a book about pregnancy. I've co-edited some books on like the anthropology of the fetus, and I co-edited a volume. It's actually this big, the Rutledge Handbook on anthropology of reproduction. So it is an area that, so like, I love the question of like, why is it overlooked when there's so much to say and know, and it's so overlooked and under-acknowledged, even though like that's how we got here. And so whether or not we are actively reproducing another generation or we're ourselves a product of reproduction, here we are. We're involved in it. So your question about like why is it overlooked is like that's the question, right? So, it's certainly it's been a very fruitful research career and now teaching career because I get to teach anthropology of reproduction. So I know I have a couple of students here who are from that class, and it's frankly it's a blast for me to like bring into the light a topic that it's like shocking. Like when I became a mother almost 19 years ago, it took me apparently a PhD to have to like learn about pregnancy in order to like get through that process. So, which is embarrassing, right? Like, why did it take a PhD to like have to learn that? So, it should not. So like Summer, I was motivated by personal experience as well, but I was actually not a mother before I got my PhD, and so it's been interesting to think about. So I was really interested in just thinking through human experience and like the overlooked parts of everyday life. And reproduction is certainly one of the big ones there.
I wish I was in that class, by the way. My name is Suzanne Schireson. I am an associate professor of art and design at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, where I primarily teach painting and drawing. Most of my paintings are on this wall, and then there's like one on that back wall, but are these invented studio structures for caretakers. And my painting all through my life has always reflected what I'm going through at that time, and so my subject matter has like changed, over decades. But since having children, and particularly since having young children in the pandemic, this new body of work started because I was finding myself really strapped for time and space and all of those things, and so painting these invented studio spaces sort of as an ode, or perhaps like a dream of some solitary space, ended up being a really reflective and kind of healthy way for me to manage everything, and that's continued since then. So anyway, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it, but thank you for being here.
Great, so should we
Now
go
I'm gonna
back?
ask the question
Yeah.
that I'm sorry. So I did want to ask about like starting to peel away the reasons why this has been so overlooked, because I think it's beyond women not having opportunities in the art world. That is obviously part of it, but there is a specific feeling that this subject has been avoided by women, avoided by feminist artists. I think sometimes women have been encouraged to avoid it, and I would like to get at that. And I was thinking of Sallie because she's talked a lot in her essay about this kind of knowledge not being valued or considered knowledge at all, considered unknowledge.
Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, and writing the essay about these works, and so it's very much out of my comfort zone to engage with art, because I'm just like, I don't really know if I understand all this that's going on. But what I think, so one of the things I thought about a lot in looking at these works and thinking them through and then writing the essay, which will be in the catalog, is how much actually like art and ethnography and cultural anthropology is like, signature method of like participating in people's lives and getting to know how much, and then bringing something out, right? So like producing from that experience something that didn't exist before, and yet also like engages our understanding. And I think that's where I see art and anthropology like being cousins very much. And I hadn't really understood that until I had this opportunity. And then specifically why reproduction is such an important place, and maybe like the perfect place to have that, right, beginning thought there. it is taken for granted, right? So like knowledge is supposed to be something that's special and different and not always shared. I mean, that's what, like it's like a kind of terrible way to think about, maybe it's like a capitalist accumulation model or something, that if it's valuable, then not everybody has access to it. And so something about the fact that we're all born and we all got here the same way, there seems to be something like not valuable about it because it's like, it's too much supply. Right? And I think part of the taken for grantedness about this very ordinary event that we all came through the same way, right? That there's a devaluing of that. It's also like bodies, right? That, and I love that we have all this very bodily on display, there's vaginas everywhere, because like, I think there's also the social and cultural taboos and discomforts around talking and thinking about viewing body parts, right? So I think there's also, and like, reproducing humans is like, it's bodily, and there's parts of it that are probably a little yuck. I mean, there's like fluids and things, so it's kind of, so I think it like, as central and important and core as it is, there's something about its ordinariness, but also the shock. We made it shocking by saying, you can't talk about that big, right? So it is like, it's weirdly contradictory, I find, right? That it's like, it's the thing that's so taken for granted because it's so not, like there's too much supply, but like, you don't want to like, talk about like, I don't know, all like the amniotic fluid or something. It's just like, there's just, let's just keep that in a shelf somewhere that we don't have to think and talk about. It's not polite. Right?
That's great, thank you, Sally.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to add to that? Maybe from the perspective of an artist, if you are aware that you shouldn't talk about that, and if you were aware of why?
There is definitely, I think, this this perceived schism between art and motherhood, that perhaps, the idea in a way that perhaps a mother can't be as critical because of like the nature of care and of generosity that is associated like with that role. And so the role of the artist is this selfish, totally stereotyping, right? But, locked alone in their room with their thoughts, with their ideas, and a mother is so the foil character to that in so many ways. So there is, I think, with those personas, there's this schism that's been created, and I don't know, we began to talk about it last night, like what are some things that have contributed to that. I think there's a lot there to sort of open up, but I do think that there's been so much more emphasis on care within our culture, especially since the pandemic, and I don't think that there's that much of a surprise that we're seeing a lot more work made about motherhood and about mother artists, because that theme of care is now something that's being discussed, and on a lot of different critical levels within the art world. But that as a subject, care as a subject within art history, wasn't really something that was really as large as I think it's becoming now. So I guess I would just start with those two things.
Can I add that I think it's really important in this kind of conversation that we pull the lens all the way back and realize that much of art throughout human history did have to do with securing the benefits of successful reproduction. If you look at a lot of art before and beyond what we kind of consider the Western canon, you will find that the reasons that much world art was made and continues to be made was asking for protections over women, and that is also in early Greco-Roman art, for example. So you have to have this broader view of how art expressive culture function within societies. And it's really important to have that when you're thinking about how and why visual art right now is an important space to be engaging and responding to these social issues. The idea that you can use visual language to marginalize a segment of society, for example, women in this case, looking at kind of the modern era in art. By design, no one was stepping up to say, hey, let's include the female anatomy and the experiences of the female body as a central point in what's going into the canon in art history. No. This canon took shape at a time where women were deliberately being marginalized on a lot of levels. So the visual language of that marginalization is something that we have to think of in the broadest terms of how that works in a society.
So I am actually not an artist, but I still have a couple of things to say about this. One thing is, it seems to me that the idea of childbirth is used as a metaphor often for creativity, and it is the ultimate creative act in my view. And so that makes it especially odd that it hasn't appeared more in art over the years and in the canon. But I would also say that, so this is a very personal view of mine, it's not something that I've heard anywhere else, but taking the opposite point of view of the old psychoanalytic, so the old Freudian psychoanalytic concept of penis envy, really, if you think about it, okay, maybe a penis is something that little girls wish they could have when they saw their brothers playing around with theirs. But actually, what's more enviable? Being able to bring a child, to carry a child until, for a full 9 months, and then give birth, and then nurse that child for a year or two. I mean, what is a more creative act than that in the world? And I often ask myself how many men, really envy women for having that capability. So in our culture, certainly up until fairly recently, I think it was viewed as, it was kind of generally accepted in our society that because you were a woman and you had children, that was your job and that kept you from doing anything interesting. But no one really focused, so the idea of motherhood became something that prevented you from doing something better, something more respect-worthy, something more admirable, something more amazing, and just kept you stuck at home. But really, that act of carrying a child and then raising that child is about the most creative thing you could do. So I asked myself whether it's possible that given that men were in charge of the canon, and given that men are not able to have children and raise them, maybe there's a deep-seated feeling of real envy that doesn't get talked about very much by anybody and doesn't get mentioned. So that's a personal thought of mine that I haven't really seen.
Because if you take this as the metaphor for the creative act, I mean, one of the metaphors I think we have for the creative act is in Western Christian culture is the creator God and the artist being modeled after that male creator God. If you were to subvert that into a more female idea, then it would mean that women were sort of the natural artists and men were maybe not. So that would fit with that in some ways.
But that's true. I mean, I'm not really necessarily going to go that far with how I would.
Well, I'm not saying that's true, but it could imply that to some people.
Yeah, sure. Or it could just be, I mean, I think that maybe most women who've given birth and had children feel that that's one of the central experiences of their lives that they have been blessed to have. And men don't really have that. They're kind of onlookers. So how central an experience is that for men that how central, but how pushed back, repressed, never thought of, is the fact that they go through life without ever being able to do that.
That's really interesting.
So it's kind of making me think of behind you over here, right, Tirtzah's piece is The Origin of the World, right? If you haven't had a chance to look around, if we conceptualize the origin of the world around this creator, the divine creator being God in the image of man versus where creation really begins over here, it looks quite different. So, and I was just making that connection as you were speaking, but I would like to add a couple of maybe observations on thoughts on why we don't talk about reproduction and talk about motherhood. I think there's some practical reasons why maybe we don't see a lot of representation of artwork by mothers, other than the fact that they were maybe intentionally left out of the canon or left out of the spaces where they could do this. But even right now, from a pragmatic perspective, when you have children, when you have small children especially, it is incredibly hard to find the time and the space to do something that is creative, to have that kind of focus. And so there are pragmatic reasons for that, but those are also connected to, I think, the way that we've organized reproduction and the way that we've organized motherhood. So when I think of motherhood, the thing about motherhood is this: it means something different. Like, it's something that we all take for granted, we all think we know what it means, but it really probably means something different to each of us. And so when I think about motherhood, I think about it as an experience because it's an experience that I've had, and that means one thing to me. But when I think about motherhood, I also think about it as a critical scholar, as an academic, because that's what I do. And so when I think of motherhood, I'm thinking about the social organization of reproduction and how we do that. And that's what motherhood is. Motherhood is the way in contemporary culture and across a lot of cultures historically that we have figured out how we're going to take care of children. And so the burden of that care, the labor of it, falls onto a particular group of people solely a lot of times as individuals. And so it's not just like pragmatically that mothers don't have a lot of time to make art, it's also by design of the way that we're organized that mothers don't have a lot of time to make art, because they don't have time because they are the primary caregivers for children. Or maybe they're the primary caregivers for other people's children. So I think that motherhood not being visible in some ways is pragmatic, but it's also, if it was more visible, we might start to reveal the messier and uglier parts of the way that we've organized motherhood. And this is kind of reminding me of your work a lot, actually. So I don't know if you have anything else to say about this, Kyrin, but it's like the stories that I think, eternal histories even, that haven't been told. They reveal things about our history, our collective history, that maybe a lot of people don't want to see.
Yeah, I agree with the way that motherhood is valued and coded, and my current project is really looking at the womb as a site of power, potential, psychic association, and a segment of the project takes it away from its function in childbearing and just talks about it as a bodily organ that we all have, and also a psychic space that you can enter in and out of, whether there's a womb in your body at the moment or there is not, or no matter what it's doing. But these ideas of visualizing the womb, it's really on us as artists who are mothers to take that up in interesting and innovative ways, because if we look to history, we're going to find all kinds of completely crazy ways it's been taken up by people who might not have been born with the womb. You have your concept of the wandering womb as an explainer of hysteria and women's erratic behavior. That's also a tool of oppression, when you can marginalize a woman, saying that her reproductive capacities make her uncontrollable and therefore less than. and therefore equated with animality. There's a quote in a piece that I'm working on right now that does talk about the womb as a creature that can move around the body of a woman, affecting the humors and the outcomes of her behavior. And it closes with describing it as an animal within an animal. What's going on there socially, Anthropology?
Wow, and then we haven't even talked about placentas, and, an organ that we grow, that we're not born with, but that we grow, to wholesale to support right, gestation. So yeah.
Visually rich, all of it.
Yeah.
I just wondered if, you had this question of creativity, and is that this sort of thing?
We did kind of touch on motherhood as a metaphor for creativity. I wanted to know how that had informed how you saw yourself as an artist, or if there was a time when you saw that.
I love that row right over there of index cards. That's maybe one of my favorite things in the show. And what I love about it is the immediacy. Madeline Donahue, whose paintings are on the wall, these are just these tiny little sketches, and I don't know when she's doing them, but I'm imagining her snatching time in between something to kind of just get the information down. And it is a very difficult time with young children to make time for art for a number of reasons, but it also feels like a particularly fertile time, no pun intended, right? But that I think you're sort of at the height of a perfect storm. There's so much happening, and your senses are heightened, and I think your view of the world is crisper because you are just making decisions. I don't know. You're forced to make decisions in a different mode and at a different pace than you have in other times in your life. Before children's, I would spend much longer time in the studio kind of weighing all these different possibilities, but now I kind of have to get to work a little bit more. And I just love the idea there that that was 90 seconds where she didn't have to do the drawing, but she did. She kept making them, and you can see that energy, in the work. What was the question?
But I love this direction. That this is such a good example of if the art has to happen, it will happen. Making it happen no matter what, even if it's so cursory. I don't know if everybody's looked at these, but these are little teeny note cards that Madeline Donahue does, very quick looking sketches that often evolve into sculpture and painting, and you can see her paintings here also, but there's a immediacy to those note cards that I think addresses some of what Summer was talking about there just isn't time. And it would be easy for those to be thrown out and forgotten, and I think it's really important that
So archives.
Archives them,
we were
yes.
discussing this morning. You are brilliant, and stepping up to make a mark of any kind is worth honoring. And so the idea that we were talking about earlier of archive, that's an archive. It's something that somebody might have thought was potentially worthless, but an artist made a decision that it was not, assigned value to it, and kept it and gave it a life through context by relating it to future work. I think that is really cool. And can I also answer your question about
Creativity, motherhood as a metaphor.
Motherhood as a metaphor for creativity. We could talk and think about an artistic practice that has to grow with a person throughout their lives and change, and mine certainly has. And we can also talk about the idea of practices being how you live out your vocation as an artist and the things that you do, such as little sketches that you make intentionally and keep. One intention that worked for me was visualizing that my life with my children was an act of expressive culture, that the household I created was my installation, and that the dynamics of tracing who I am, moving spatially and temporally through this role of mother now, is something that's written about and is graphed onto the experiences of how we lived in our home, what the wear treads we wore into the kitchen floor going back and forth, or what, furniture got demolished from nursing too many children on it. So expanding the idea of the edges of a creative space, they have to evolve and revolve around the creative person. So your activity as a mother is, I've called it my field trip. And it's made me feel a lot better about justifying taking the scenic route, and it taking a long time. There's a lot of field work in that.
I thought that was kind of a good question too, but I don't, it's almost a good question.
And what do you wish college-age persons understood about motherhood broadly, and perhaps about the work featured in this exhibit more specifically?
I feel like almost everyone can speak to that.
You want to start? Who would like to start? Susan, would you like to start?
Let's see. There's so many possible things to say about this. I've been thinking about one thing in the last 2 minutes that maybe relates to that a little bit, but in a kind of more specific way, maybe. I think it's something that I've learned recently, and something that I think researchers are recently starting to focus on increasingly in the last 10 years, maybe more, which is this idea that a lot of things that you do as a mother are considered to be kind of trivial and unimportant, even by the mother when she's doing them. So, and yet some of those things turn out to be incredibly important. So, for example, a mother's and a father's and anybody else's interactions with a baby in the first 6 to 12 months of life, even the first 4 months of life, are really, really important. And they are, so I don't want to come off as somebody who's trying to persuade you that you should pick motherhood over a career or something like that. That's not my intention at all. But I do think it's really useful and important and validating to know that those interactions with a child, with a very young child that seem to be of little or no consequence and that just come naturally to most people, are actually an extraordinarily important part of how that child is going to grow up and how that child's personality is going to be formed. And just a completely, at a verbal level, completely meaningless interaction with a baby is actually hugely important. So, because when you interact with your baby or someone else's baby, you are showing that baby by your attention that you're giving that baby that you think his thoughts and feelings and facial expressions and self-expression are important and are worthy of your attention. And there's something called serve and return, where you allow your baby, even those very young babies, to take the lead in some way. When you interact with him, you're responding to something you see in your baby's voice, in your baby's face, something you hear in his vocalizations. You're responding with your vocalizations in a way that mirrors his vocalizations, and you're probably not aware of it. And all of this is teaching your child that he's important or she's important as a person, and that his or her feelings matter. And also more mundane things, like when we interact with people, we take turns. And we cue off what they tell us. We go back and forth, like a tennis game or something. So I think that's a really kind of cool thing to know. I kind of wish I'd known about that before I had children.
I don't know if anyone else wants to respond to that, but one question just that I I also thought, a point that you brought up, motherhood versus a career, you know, and one of my questions is, are we in a time where you can do both? You know, I know people out here in the audience have, right? And continue to have both. I mean, it's not one or the other. I mean, it used to be, right? I mean, that's sort of what we were talking about in art history, or historically in art. You know, if you were a woman and you were making artwork and then you had children, then forget about your career. It's over, right? And I know that it's a struggle for women in professional fields, whether you're an academic professor or a professional artist. I mean, it still is. And in some ways, Summer was bringing up, Summer or Sally was talking about the cultural, you know, support, and I was just thinking about, you know, how we. And so this is kind of off topic for what maybe college students want to know about motherhood. I don't know what they would want to know, but I know from when I was in college, you know, that it was almost a fear to get pregnant. Like I was just terrified. I still am, actually. It's a big job, you know. It's a huge responsibility. That's how I viewed it, and you're never done, right? But I just wonder, like. You know, and I know in Europe, for instance, you in many, or maybe we were talking in Canada, you as a mother, you get a year maternity leave, paid maternity leave. You know, and that doesn't exist here. You know, some people only get a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month.
Well, I'll pick that up because I teach anthropology reproduction, and the semesters I've taught it, at some point or other, we talk about parental leave, and over the years that I've taught it, like that is always one of the shocking, like, we'll talk about menstruation, we'll talk about all kinds of topics and then menopause. But when we talk about parental leave, and I'm like, well, you know, you're not actually entitled to it in the United States. Like that's not, the FMLA is what we have, and then if you have a private corporate employer, you might get some extra time. So it's always one of the most shocking things that my students did not know before they came into my class. And until I started studying care work, I also did not understand it. And frankly, I didn't start studying care work until, like, you know, I sort of needed some. I needed to do it. But it's really, I do think, if there's like, I was thinking about your broader question of like, what do we, like one, I do think it's really important to ask, what do you guys want to know, right? And so I try to address that in my class. I build syllabi around that. That's why like it's a semester to answer the questions that I think ought to be answered for college students. But I think one of the most important things that I can think of, and it does relate to this, is like, you really can't do it alone. Like, we weren't meant to do it alone. So, like, mothers, like, even when you are a single mother, what that means is you still need a network, right? And even when you're a partnered mother, you still need maybe more than the partner. Like, you need. So in anthropology, like evolutionary anthropologists talk about cooperative breeding. And it's a term that's used to talk about like different kinds of animal species, right? And not just humans. But boy, of all the species with our particular like quirks as the kind of species that we are, right? And the very long time it takes to like not only gestate and produce these offspring, but then their heads are all wobbly and they can't get up and start walking around and they can't procure food. They can't make a living until they've been educated, you know, all these things. I mean, like, we don't have precocious offspring. Like, you know, like, our offspring require a lot of care, like, in terms of when you look at versus other animal species. So we cannot do this ourselves. Like, we weren't, in fact, evolved to do it ourselves, right? So when it comes to, like, contemporary modern people and our politics and all that, like, the other big point is, like, not only is reproduction social, it's so political, right? And I mean that in the sense that, like, the support that we get or don't get, those are deliberate decisions, right? And those are what we as societies decide what our priorities are. And so, like, we, hopefully college students, but even younger and older, like, all of us can find something out, right, about what can we do to support this, and we can play our part in it. So I think the basic principle of we weren't meant to do this alone is really important.
I mean, I thought brought that back question, what do college students want to know about motherhood? I think that's a great question to ask. Or if other people have other questions. And I think we have 15 minutes. Okay, thank you. So yeah, it is a good time if anyone has questions.
May I add on to, this is not a question, may I add on?
Sure.
A lot of times I want to say in society when it comes to women see that motherhood is it's the side, it is sad to know that there are hundreds, thousands of women who are single mothers and don't have any support to raise a child. And this was a saying that my mom had always told me, it takes a village to raise a child. So you do need a network. So it's not just the mother or the father. It needs all the support, the whole family, the grandparents, the uncles, the cousins, anybody. And I feel society today, just how neighbors are. I always had neighbors, but it wasn't the type of neighbors that would hey, do you need help with your kid, that type of thing. But then I see that in movies and fairy tales, and I'm thinking society would be so much better if everyone just cared for one another like that, where it's they help one another. If they see a mother struggling or a parent struggling, they go and help that family. Everyone is in their own world and they're quiet, they're scared to talk to people, there are dangers out there. So yeah, I just feel like motherhood is something that is sacred, and even just parenthood, it's very sacred, and it's sad to hear that people put all of that to the side, or women are just stupid mentality.
That's such a good point, and I think too, we were talking about careers, and so often a career or a job takes you away from your family, takes you away from that network. So then it's even more difficult, to have that village, to have the help of that extended family when so many of us are moving away from kind of where we grew up. And so within this era, within this moment, that sort of adds another level of complexity to it too. But those are just great points.
Which also leads to the question of, why are we doing it? Why are we leaving family units to pursue a career? Our value system, we're questioning our value system, right? So why is there more value put on, I hate to say it out loud, but the almighty dollar than on staying close to family? I don't understand that at all.
So I've been stuck on Susan's point about whether it's the uterus or the vaginal envy, and you actually gave my daughter her favorite toy at Bassett, so thank you for that. But I'm kind of stuck on that. I'm wondering about societal roles in motherhood and parenting. For me, I've recently made the decision to go back to school. I work full time. I have a 2-year-old, and so there's a lot of sacrifices you have to make, but at the same time, as we're talking about, there's all those activities that you do that you just take for granted because you just know how to do it, and then it's you have the paternal side of things where they see okay, well, baby's upset, I'm gonna go to mommy, so it's almost there's this inherent need to provide and value that almighty dollar because that's what you can do as a father, because you can't do the reproduction, you can't do basic child rearing, so it's almost you're stuck in this idea of okay, what can I do? I have to do it.
You can do the basic child rearing.
You can, and
You can't
I've had to have
squeeze out the baby, but the rest of it you could do.
Sure.
That's one thing that's kind of missing.
But there's the connection of baby to mother from birth through early life to where it's almost okay, you have both options, pick which one you want. And so a lot of times my daughter's upset, she's running to me, and it's not because I don't have support in the house. I'm just more comforting because I literally nourished her since she was born, and so there's that extra connection there. And then just also the point about it does take a village. Me making this decision wasn't okay, I'm gonna set you on the floor and I'm gonna leave for the day, I'll see you later. There were a lot of conversations this is where I need support, this is what I'm going to have to be doing, and so those roles kind of shift too, like within that village, so it's all just, I don't know, it's all very interesting, and to think about like how it connects into like the creativity aspect, and I haven't had a chance to look yet, but I love that idea of like just finding the time to have that creativity, because there is no time. I can't tell you the last time I painted.
Oh, finger painting's coming soon, don't worry about it.
I mean, that should count for something, you're right.
So,
Sorry, go ahead.
So your comments, both of your comments are kind of, making me think about the fact that a lot of us might enter into a career where we have to move away from family. I mean, most of my family is in Arizona, and here I am in upstate New York. I don't have any family here, but my son is grown now, so that makes it a little bit easier. But you do need a network, and for sure I needed one. I also moved away from where I grew up to go to graduate school, and being like somewhere with no friends, no family, no support network, and being a single mom, that was incredibly difficult. It was incredibly hard on my son. And so I had to form a different support network where I was with people who weren't, my relatives. And so I guess I just want to say, like, I think it's the whole society, it's the culture that we live in that isn't really, we're not doing things in a way that are conducive to people other than mothers providing care for children. We could be. It could be possible to move somewhere for your career and to be working in a space or going to school even in a space where it was more conducive to mothering. I mean, you don't see children on this campus, right? But there are mothers on this campus.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a place to nurse on this campus? Is there a lactation space on this campus? I mean, there are so many spaces like that that really just are not, mother-friendly or child-friendly, or they completely disregard this idea that caregiving is a part of life. And then we can think about other kinds of networks as they relate to that as well. So I think it's like at a cultural level as well that we could really be doing things differently in a way that would support caregiving of children and then support mothers doing lots of other things and not just being the sole caregivers. So.
And if it's culture, that means we have a choice, right? Because it's culture is by definition human invention. So we have made, and when I was saying before, it's political, right? So we've made decisions. We can make different decisions. Is it hard? Yes, very hard. But it's not impossible, and when you were saying, like, what about neighbors? I'm like, maybe we need education on how to be better neighbors, right? Like, maybe we could start a radical movement, a social movement that's like, be your Mr. Rogers. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, be better neighbors. Like that, like we need that. Like that could be a social change.
One of the things I would just like to add is that one thing I've noticed with a husband who's in healthcare and myself who's working in academia and the arts is that where they really need workers, they will work with others. They will let them work part-time. They will pay them a fair wage for working part-time. They will hire their husbands if their husbands need to move there with them, or hire spouses. They will work with a lot of things. They will build daycare centers on site work. Academia doesn't do it. And I think the reason academia doesn't do it is because academia views a lot of their workers as cheap and lucky to be there. And so they don't work with them.
Well, and as minds only, not as bodies.
Yes.
Not minds and bodies, but minds only.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a departure, so apologies. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the flip side of mothering, which if possible feels like even more of a taboo. Like miscarriages, birth control, and abortion. These are things that I see subtly hinted at in a lot of pieces in this show. Like, for example, Madeline's pregnancy test, the valuation of it is an abortion in Texas, which is $1,200 by current estimate. Or like Rose's piece behind you guys, which I think brings in a lot of like vaginal fear. It makes me think of a very great cult horror movie called Entada about vaginas.
I forgot about that.
Right. But then you see pieces like Tirtzah Bassel, which is about the death of the mother in childbirth, which has a huge, long, horrific history. And then, if I'm not misinterpreting it, Beth doula, which in my mind speaks a bit to miscarriage, but also abortion and all of those choices. And I think it's hard to have a conversation about mothering without talking about those, because miscarriage is so prevalent. But how many women know that almost every woman who's had a baby has had a miscarriage?
It's actually true.
That was a very romantic question.
No, that's a great question. I'm curious what is it?
Yeah, no, when I think and talk about reproduction, one thing that, like, I feel like college students will ask, has to do exactly with those questions. So, like, pregnancy, the pregnancy test sculpture is really interesting. It's this modern invention, like the whole pregnancy test becomes available in the 70s and 80s. And then, like, in my class, we just talked about how, like, Egyptian women, like in like the 10th century BC, whatever, like peed on seeds, and if they sprouted, then you knew the woman was pregnant. So urine-based pregnancy testing is actually like quite old. They didn't know the exact mechanism. They just knew that like something like that, the urine of a pregnant woman was different from the urine of a woman who's not pregnant, or from a man's urine. So I think that's just so interesting.
Did it actually work?
Yeah, no, they because like there's, you know, because they didn't know what HCG was. They just, but the presence of HCG could germinate these seeds.
Oh, wow.
So
Was it a specific seed?
Yeah, it was a specific like spelt or something. I don't know what it was.
And that knowledge has been around for
For a
so
long time. But trial and error, you know, like it worked. But also the knowledge that like, you know, so for example, like pregnancy tests, you didn't assume that you were pregnant until a baby was born. So like medieval Germany, like the idea that like you can't pronounce someone pregnant until like you have a living child born. And if you did not have a living child, if a child was not born alive, that didn't necessarily mean you were pregnant either. Right?
Wow.
So it's a way of interestingly framing your story in retrospect in some interesting ways. And part of it has to do with like how you confirm your knowledge, where you get your knowledge, and therefore what you're able to tell in your story, right? But I think it's really interesting that like our modern technologies, things like pregnancy tests and fetal ultrasounds, like that they cause us to actually tell a certain kind of story, right? Which wouldn't have been told that way necessarily. Like I think it's fascinating to think about that you wouldn't just declare yourself pregnant until after you had a baby. Like that's so interesting, and it sounds like astounding and weird to us right now, but like it kind of makes sense, right?
It's so interesting. I mean, just thinking about, I want to hear from Beverly, but just like the political discussion of at what point, you know, is the germinated, you know, see, like when does birth or when does life begin, right?
And everyone has had different answers to that.
So I'm wondering who decided that was when you could say that you were pregnant? Because women know if they're pregnant within a month or so. So was
But I
it
guess
men
it's the
who said
cultural construct, right?
you're not pregnant unless you?
It's just culturally how they defined.
I think it's different to say that a woman knew something was going on in her body and probably knew that she was pregnant. I'm not suggesting that people were ignorant of their own bodies, but did it matter socially?
But and who defined whether it mattered socially? I mean, does that mean that women's own feelings about what they felt in their own bodies weren't trusted? That it wasn't legitimate to?
I think it was understood differently.
I think it's understood differently in the sense that if you didn't count as a pregnancy, then what was lost didn't have to be counted as a child, which does matter, and it matters who thinks that, right?
But I wonder how that maps with the dynamics around protecting virginity and knowing descent for offspring. That's really interesting because in many cultures and for so long in kind of the Western tradition, there's a feeling of ownership over a daughter, and that you need that daughter to be unspoiled for marriage in the social framework. So this idea that you're not pregnant until you produce a child might land very differently on a father who has to settle a daughter into a marriage that's advantageous, what happens then?
Yeah, also, so this is Germany, like.
Oh, well, I mean, so that's one of the documents. There's this book called by Barbara Duden, Disembodying Women. It was written in the 90s, and that's one of the particular, like she does like early modern Germany. So so she was working with some manuscripts that talk about the recognition of pregnancy in retrospect, or what we would consider in retrospect, right? But I do think that's where we have to like run into like, we want to pay attention to the specifics, right? So like we want to like, so that particular area of Germany at that particular time versus something that's going on in England, like right, we can't like necessarily generalize. So I think it's really, and of course, it's written documents. So you also need to be a little suspicious of like what's being recorded.
Right.
Is
Or what
that
people are believing.
descriptive or is it prescriptive?
But I wonder if that's protecting women from being blamed for stillborn children,
Yeah.
which was something. I mean, I actually have ancestors who were persecuted for witchcraft in Massachusetts because they were hiding stillborn babies, buried them, and not reporting the stillbirths because it's all related to witchcraft.
And actually, there's a current, like more recent ethnographic work. Like actually, one of the chapters that I have in my volume is this woman who does work on reproductive losses in Cameroon, and indeed, she's talking with certain like local communities that have certain ideas about what counts as pregnancy, right? And in the context of like marriage being incredibly important, not necessarily virginity, but marriage and lineage being very important. And so if women are blamed for getting pregnant, they're also blamed for losing pregnancies, right? And making decisions about that. So in that case, yes, like stories that we tell about what accounts for pregnancy losses can be, as you say, an out. It can excuse someone or absolve us of responsibility for which we might otherwise be punished. So it's interesting to see it, right? So that's a logic that I think is built in, but maybe not always articulated that way. Yeah.
So it looks like we've come full circle because nowadays we're punishing women again in some states for having miscarriages and stillbirths. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
I know you had your hand up.
Well, just going off what's been said, I would be curious as to how that woman felt, because that denies that whole experience of her growing and her body changing and everything else, you know. And hooray that, you know, she's not being blamed now for that stillborn, but it's still denial. And I think about not so long ago in this culture, or England, a stillborn baby was born, it was whisked away. The mother never saw it, never held it, never looked at it, and the trauma that caused to so many women. I mean, some women maybe wouldn't want to see that stillborn. And it hasn't been that many years that there's been this path towards, okay, let's honor that birth even though it was stillborn. Let's have a photographer take pictures so that family can say, this happened. Because then you are allowed to grieve as well, which is such an important part.
I mean, to me, I understand that as like the cultural construct, right, around birth. Like it used to be the practice that was accepted that it would be whisked away, but now we're sort of maybe softening, but not. You know, I mean, it's just.
Well, and I think Carrie could speak to. A lot of babies being whisked away also.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we talk about I don't see how any person who's descended from slavery in this country could not be pro-choice. Because we have a history of Black women in this country having no juridic protections over their father experiences and no rights to their own offspring. To me, that puts a big no, a complete full stop to any legislative activity to limit women's control of their own body categorically, because so much of the detriment of a doctrine called Partus Sequitur Vitrum, which dates back to like 1692, made a decision in the language that would be used to talk about livestock that enslaved women were not owners of their own offspring, that the condition of such offspring followed the mother, so that there was a complete severance of rights of maternity. And it did not end well for many, and right now, the healthy thing to do is look at it as a legacy of your survival, that families and individuals were able to sustain that type of violence. But it's really important to be aware of as we try to think holistically about how we address each other as Americans.
Oh, I'm sorry, we're at time, but I just thank you so much for this amazing panel. It was so great to hear such a range of views and perspectives. And I was just thinking throughout, returning to that first question of why it's not talked about, what you were just saying kind of brought me back there, because I think that feminism has, in a sense, even after second wave feminism, tried to distance women from that labor so that we can be performing capitalist subjects who can move all over the country, have jobs, not depend on people. And that legacy of violence in the US that works differently for different bodies. There's been kind of a turning away from motherhood, I think, that only now, both with like in visual arts and in the literary sphere, more women are making art that admits motherhood and grapples with this problem of trying to have it all, which you kind of can't, but also we all do, you know, at the same time. So yeah, I just think those tensions are interesting, both claiming motherhood and trying to, you know, kind of not talk about it as we search for equality as juridical subjects in a sense. So anyway, thank you for such a great panel.
Thank you.